And last Sunday's gospel reading, we heard the first encounter of Andrew and Simon Peter with Jesus. And if you recall, Andrew was standing with John the Baptist, and John pointed out Jesus, "Behold the Lamb of God." Andrew followed him, and it was about 4 p.m. He stayed with him that afternoon and listened to him and was already convinced by that short time together that Jesus was the Messiah. And he went and found his brother Simon, brought him to Jesus, and Jesus says, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Peter." And yet after that, of course, they believed in Jesus, but they went home. They went back to their families and back to their jobs. Now today we hear the official or the formal call of Peter and Andrew, James and John to something far greater. They're doing their work, they're fishermen, and Jesus comes and says to them, "Come after me, and I will make you fishers of men." And immediately, without hesitating, they drop everything and follow him, and they never go back to their work. They never go back to anything else. They become his followers who stay with him day in and day out. Eventually, they will be 4 of the 12 apostles. And the ones who spend their entire lives completely immersed in Jesus, that all that matters to them is carrying on what Jesus tells them to do, and after Pentecost, continuing to catch people and bring them to Jesus as he did with them. And of course, this beautiful story of the call of the first 4 apostles of Jesus has traditionally always been used and reflected upon by those discerning a vocation to the priesthood. And we've talked about how Jesus calls all of us to follow him, but among those of all the people that he calls to follow him, he selects some to leave families and friends and everything else behind and stay with him completely and serve and follow him. And priests do that. You'll see that every day at the end of Masses, where the people who are present for the Mass go back to their homes and their families, but the priest remains here. He lives at the church. He doesn't leave Jesus. We stay permanently doing our duty here. And so the Lord's call to anyone being called to the priesthood is a call to abandon everything, leave all their dreams and plans behind, and come and follow the Lord. And of course, whenever I hear this gospel, I have to think back on my own call to the priesthood. And I can honestly say, I wish I had followed the way Peter and Andrew did, that just dropped everything the first time I thought Jesus was calling me to be a priest and just immediately said, "Yes, Lord," and followed it. Obviously, ultimately, I did accept that call, but I didn't do it immediately. Of course, it took some hemming and hawing and some praying and some debating on my part back and forth as to whether or not I was going to do this. And I first remember when I first started thinking that God might be calling me to the priesthood, I had grown up around priests, and priests had done wonderful things for me. One priest in particular, when I was a boy, Father Kenny, and I idolized him. I wanted to be just like him. And the thought that God was calling me to be able to be and do what Father Kenny did, I said, wow, there was a great honor and a thought in that. But then there was the other part of me that said, who am I to do what he does? He's Father Kenny the Great. How could I possibly do the things that he does? I'm a nothing. Thankfully, when I spoke with my college chaplain about it, he says, God wouldn't call you to do something if you didn't have the skills or if he wouldn't give you what you needed to do it. He wouldn't be calling you to a life you can't possibly fulfill. He says, so don't be afraid. God will give you whatever you need. And it was good advice, and I was able to trust that. And so while I was on the one hand thrilled at the idea of the priesthood, on the other hand I was a little frightened by the thought that could I possibly carry out all of this immense duty that I knew it would be to be a priest, and my chaplain in college thankfully helped me with that. But then of course came the personal side of it, and that is, as you know, we as Catholic priests leave everything to follow the Lord. And that means that we are called to be celibate, not to marry, not to have our own children, not to have careers on the outside, that the priesthood will be our 100% of our life. It will be our career. The parish will be our family. We will not have wives and children of our own. And we will live constantly just serving the parish and the people that Jesus gives us to us. And he asks us to leave all that behind so as to be his priests. And that, of course, gave me a little trouble. Because I had dreamed of being married and having a family from when I was little. I was going to have lots of kids. And one thing in particular I had seen from my youth, and that was my son. I imagined little Andrew Jr. from when I was this big. I imagined my son. And he and I were going to be a father-son team par excellence. I was going to teach him, he was going to look up to me, and we'd be inseparable. We'd do everything together. And I dreamed about that. And of course, it was a good thing. We're not talking about something that would be bad. And as I started thinking about all the different things that we'd have to give up in order to become a priest, I realized the hardest one of all was giving up my dream to be a father and have my own son. And I was always the type of person that, if I went to a store, for example, and saw two shirts that I liked, one in red and one in blue, and I didn't know which one I liked more, well, very simply, I bought them both. No big deal. So that was the way I usually tried to settle things. Well, this idea of being called to be a priest and giving up my son, it was very much treated by me in the same way. And I prayed about it, and I started thinking it through. And, I looked one thing after the other, made lists and prepared them against the other. And being married, being a priest, all the pluses and minuses always came out equal. Because we're not talking about good versus evil. We're talking about two sacraments, two beautiful ways of serving the Lord and of becoming part of him. So it was, which one does God want me to do? So with that, still that problem of my son, I tried to figure out something that I could do to maybe have both of those ways come true. And I remember one day I was praying and I said, well, God, maybe I'll get married and have a son, and then I'll get lucky and my wife will die young, and then I can go off and become a priest. And the minute I said that to myself, I said to myself, you fool. I said, a wife is not merely a means to have a child. You fall in love with a woman, she's going to be the other half of you, the one who more than any other is going to help you find the Lord and grow in your love and service of him, in your love for her. So how could that possibly get lucky that your wife would die young? That's ridiculous. And I realized what I was trying to do. I was trying to have it both ways, and I realized I couldn't have it both ways. I had to make a choice. And as I said, I weighed them one against the other, and they always came up the equal. And finally, after doing all the praying and thinking that I could do, I finally realized I had to choose one or the other. And I was at that fork in the road. You have to either go left or go right, and you can't have both of them. So I remember praying and finally saying, all right, Lord, listen, I can't make up my mind. I can't figure out what I want to do. And you know what? It's not about what I want to do. It's about what you want me to do. So I said, Lord, pick a card, any card. Like I was holding out and saying, fine, whatever you want. You want me to get married and raise a family? I'll get married and raise a family. You want me to become a priest? I'll become a priest. You show me what you want, and that's what I'll do. And I remember anytime I prayed the Lord's Prayer, when we got to the line, thy will be done, I would bow my head as I prayed it, saying, Lord, you just show me what you want me to do, and I will do it. And from that point on, there was never any thought in my mind but that God wanted me to be a priest. And so I accepted that, but I still had that problem of my son. And what was I going to do to get over that? And so finally one day as I was praying, something came to me and I said, well, Father, you gave up your son for me. I'll give up mine for you. And it worked. And I was able to leave that behind and move on and enter the seminary. And before that, of course, tell my family that I wanted to become a priest, and they were thrilled. And I went on and was ordained, and nearly 34 years later, I'm very happy with it. In fact, if I could see now, even just one day, one of the beautiful events of the many that I have experienced as a priest over these years, when I first thought the Lord was calling me, maybe like Peter and Andrew, James and John, I would have dropped everything and said, Lord, I'm here. I'm ready to do it. If only I could see it then. The apostles, when they were called by Jesus, he didn't tell them what it was going to mean, what they were going to have to do to follow him. They only knew this is what Jesus wanted, and they didn't hesitate, and they followed him. If only I had given myself to the Lord completely at that moment. Thankfully, when I look at my own life, I see that I at least finally did that, and I'm grateful to God for that. But I come across many men who tell me that they seriously thought God was calling them to be a priest, but they said, no, for whatever reason or another. And they said down the line, sometimes several of them have told me how much they regret it. They said, Father, every time I see you up there in the pulpit, I think that's what I was really supposed to be doing. And so many other things. Maybe their family stood in the way. They wanted to pursue the priesthood, and their parents said, no, you owe me grandchildren, or something like that, which is a horrible thing to say to a child, because I say, suppose the child never gets married, never has any children. Would you tell your son he's a failure because he didn't give you grandchildren? Nobody owes anybody anything like that. Nobody has a right to children, and nobody has a right to grandchildren. They are God's gift to us. And my family is here with us today, and I know of course, my parents have 4 grandchildren of their own, but my mother will tell you that whenever she's gone to places where I was assigned in the past, the people always came to her, especially young people even, with great deference. They fawned all over her. They would give her so much love and so much attention. In my last parish, one of the young men gave her the nickname of the Queen Bee, which he meant very much in a positive, affectionate term. And so she's had other types of grandchildren, if you will, my parents, in addition to the 4 biological grandchildren they have. And then I look at my own life and see how many families I've become part of. There are so many different families that I've come to know over the years that I jokingly say I've become basically their private family chaplain. Whenever there's a sacrament necessary in the family, Father Carrozza gets the call, whether it's a baptism, a wedding, a funeral, whatever it may be, and sometimes even just celebrations, they want me there. I remember only shortly after I was ordained, maybe only a year or 2, I was called to bring communion to an elderly lady in the parish, and I brought communion, and she had one of those old TV consoles, where you could put pictures on the top, and she had family portraits all over the top of the TV console, and I looked over, and there was a picture of her granddaughter on her first communion day with me in the picture. I looked and I said, I'm already in this person's house even before I stepped foot in. I was amazed and humbled to see that she already had a picture of me because I was the priest who gave her granddaughter First Holy Communion. And how many different families I have become part of over the course of the years. And then the children that God has given me. Yes, I had to sacrifice my own dreams of children, but that doesn't mean I haven't had them in a different way. Last week, for example, I celebrated my birthday, and I received 10 phone calls from young people who were children I worked with in previous assignments, who are now, or some of them are in their late 30s, but they called to wish me a happy birthday. Some of them are living out of state, married with children there, and yet they call to wish me a happy birthday. Whenever they're in town, they call me and say, Father, we're going to be in for a few days. We want to get together and take you out to dinner. And I looked at that and said, how many other people have somebody calling them that much? I had 10 young people that I'm not directly involved with anymore who called just to wish me a happy birthday. And I've been there for many times in their life that for things that maybe I wasn't biologically their father, but I was spiritually their father. And they turned for me for comfort and counsel in ways that maybe they thought they never could turn to their own fathers for. And so I may not have biologically fathered children, but I have so many spiritual children who looked up to me as a spiritual father and even call me father. And so the Lord says, anyone who gives up home and family and brothers and sisters for me will receive 100 times as many families and homes and brothers and sisters. Well, the Lord keeps his word. He's certainly done that for me. And I'm grateful to him for that. And I honestly don't feel that I have lost anything or that I'm suffering because I didn't have children of my own. In fact, sometimes when I work with the young people here, I tell their parents, I get the best of both worlds. I get to enjoy them. They love me, look up to me. And then I get to send them home to you for discipline and buying their things and everything, paying all the bills. So I get the positive. And if they're annoying me, I just say, hey, take care of your kid. They're annoying me. But God does give us back for whatever we sacrifice. He is calling us to a life, a beautiful life that is so wonderful. And today I say specifically to any of the young men here who might think at any time that God is calling you to be a priest, or any girls being called to religious life. If you hear God calling you, don't be afraid. He is calling you to the most beautiful, wonderful life imaginable. I can't even begin to tell you how joyful it is every time I celebrate a sacrament, that when I baptize a baby, Christ is baptizing through me. When I forgive somebody their sins, it is Christ forgiving their sins through me. And most uniquely, when I take bread and wine at Mass and say the words of Jesus from the Last Supper, this is my body, this is my blood, it is Christ who is changing the bread and wine into his body and blood through me. And St. John Vianney, the patron saint of parish priests, even said something once that awed me, because he said, Jesus even defers to the priest and gives him authority over him, that Jesus responds at the word of the priest, that Jesus forgives and Jesus consecrates and Jesus heals when the priest asks him to do so. What a beautiful, wonderful gift that is. And so, if you, any of our young men here, think at any time God is calling you to the priesthood, or others, if it's your sons, your grandsons, your nephews, whomever it may be, that mention that they think God is calling them to the priesthood, please encourage them. You certainly know we need priests desperately. And the problem is not that God is not calling people. Sadly, there's so many things standing in the way of young men responding. Please make sure you are not an obstacle to anyone responding to the Lord's call for whatever reason it may be, but allow him and encourage him to say yes. I'm confident if that happens, the church will have all the priests we need to serve you, to serve our parishes, because I don't believe for a moment the Lord has stopped calling men to the priesthood. I think we have a serious problem of people not responding and saying yes to that call, for whatever the reason may be. But obviously, not everybody here today is a candidate for the priesthood. And many of you have found your own vocations in marriage. Some of you young people, many of you will be called by the Lord to the sacrament of marriage. But does the call of the apostles have something to say to all of us? Yes, it does. Because every one of us is called, when the Lord calls us to do whatever it is he asks us to do, whether it's a lifelong vocation, an occupation, or even something we need to do at this moment or that, all of us are called to trust God completely, leave everything, and just do his will. Just do what he asks of us, no matter what it may be. Do not be afraid to do what the Lord tells you to do. Remember, the Lord is calling us to holiness, to work with him, and in working with him, we find the joy of life that only he can bring. And sometimes people think if it means following the Lord, I have to stop loving someone else. But the Lord, as somebody who loves us, is not one who competes with the love of others. So if I follow Jesus, I can't love that man or that woman. I can't get married them. On the contrary, it is the love for Christ that helps us perfect that love of a spouse, of a child, of whomever it may be, because we're drawing that person into our love of Christ and loving Christ by loving that person. And so the love of God doesn't compete with our love for others. It enhances it. And if we find at any time that our love of God and following him is conflicting with something else, then that should be a big warning sign to us that the thing that we're loving and trying to hold on to is not good, is something we should be letting go of, because that is keeping us from loving the Lord. Loving the Lord helps us embrace everything in our lives better, our occupations, our families, the things that we do. Don't be afraid. Whatever it is that you hear God calling you to do, little things or big things, just listen to the Lord calling you and know, as he called the apostles and gave them the peace to serve him even until their death, he will give you the strength and the ability to serve him. And you will find love and joy and fulfillment in doing whatever it is that Jesus asks you to do. Do not be afraid. Christ is calling you. Listen to him. Come after me, and I will make you fishers of men, and leave all things, and come and follow Jesus. May Jesus Christ be praised, now and forever.